series deals with topics pertaining to human rights, social justice, world peace, and international development. I think our lecture tonight is going to cover just about every one of those topics. The Fall 2001 series is dedicated to Mary Douglas, the widow of Professor Lou Douglas. Mrs. Douglas was a teacher, a community activist, and a patron of this series for many years. She passed away earlier this year. Our speaker tonight is Juliette Beck, Economic Rights Coordinator for the Global Exchange. She will be introduced by Tiffany Hockman, who's one of our student interns. I'd like to take a couple of minutes right now to recognize our student interns and to thank them for all the work that they do with this series. So if you would, just stand up when I call your name. Sarah Sork, Political Science and Journalism major. Nikki Iwert, English and Public Relations major. Susan Haug, Human Ecology and Mass Communications major. Tiffany Hockman, Accounting. Derek Chirelli, Social Sciences major. Derek. Paul Yauk, Sociology and English major. Okay, thanks for helping out with this series. Okay, our thanks also go out to President Wiefald, President Kaufman, various university colleges and departments, the Student Government Association, faculty members, and the many local citizens who contribute to the Lou Douglas Lecture Series. A special thank you also goes to the Manhattan Alliance for Peace and Justice, who's sponsoring our lecture tonight, helping sponsor the lecture. After the lecture, there is going to be a question and answer period. Now, whether you're here out of your own initiative or coerced by some classroom assignment, I'm going to ask you to stay, if you can, for the question and answer session. We will take about a 2-minute break after the lecture. For those of you who have to leave, I ask you that you leave quietly. The question and answer session is a good opportunity to delve a little bit deeper into some of the issues that we'll talk about tonight, and there are usually some really good questions asked, and maybe some sparks will fly, who knows. Okay, I'm going to turn things over to Tiffany now to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
As a student here at Kansas State University, I often hear other students talking about their professional possibilities. Some people don't find their possibilities very exciting, and some people think that the careers that are exciting are too overwhelming, and they question whether or not they'll actually be able to make a difference. Juliette Beck, tonight's speaker, was a sophomore at the University of California, Berkeley, taking a class in rural development when she realized she could make a difference. She heard a lecture on the World Bank and her life was changed. The lecture sparked in her a commitment to make the world a better place to live for everyone. I couldn't stay silent, she said. I had to act. This was an area that was exciting, important, and despite the daunting nature of the task, could indeed make an important difference in the world. She felt she had received her calling. According to William Finnegan, writer in the New Yorker magazine, Juliette Beck was a brilliant student, called by one of her professors a new Renaissance person, intellectually insatiable, with an eagerness to understand the dynamics of economic development propelling her into several academic fields, including international finance and trade. By her junior year, Juliette was teaching a class on the North American Free Trade Agreement, called one of the most popular student-led classes ever taught at UC Berkeley. After graduating with an interdisciplinary degree in political ecology, Juliette went to work as an environmental engineer for a small Bay Area firm. But soon the calling of her college years took her to the nonprofit sector. She became an organizer for Public Citizen, Ralph Nader's consumer group, which successfully campaigned to stop the Clinton administration's effort to get renewed fast-track authority to negotiate trade agreements with limited congressional oversight. Currently, Juliette Beck is a policy analyst at the international human rights organization Global Exchange in San Francisco, and is known nationally as one of the key organizers of the historic Seattle protests against the World Trade Organization, and who later worked to spearhead the April 2000 protests in Washington, D.C. against the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. At 27, she has already distinguished herself with a talent for policy analysis that is coupled with unbridled energy and idealism. Juliette is here tonight to share her calling and her commitment with us, and to challenge us to understand the importance of the global economy reform for both our future and the future of the world in which we live. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Juliette Beck.
Wow, you folks in Kansas sure know how to make someone feel special. Thank you for that wonderful, warm welcome and all of the hospitality that's already been shown to me. It's my first trip to Kansas. I mean, I guess I experienced Kansas a bit vicariously through Dorothy, but here on somewhat of a whirlwind tour. I feel like a tornado touching down in 3 different stops here with you in Manhattan, and then on to Newton, and what's the last stop? Wichita. So I'll see those parts of the state and hope to come back sometime soon and see the rest of the state, because here it's got a lot of different political views around the state. And so I hope to share just my perspective and what I've been studying and thinking about and organizing around and for the last 10 years or so. And I just want to start by hoping to welcome you all to just open your minds and your hearts and explore with me some of the pressing issues of our day and age. Some big questions, multifaceted, complex, about the way the world is functioning, who it's benefiting, who the institutions of the global economy are working for. And I think that hopefully tonight you can share your experiences as well in this pursuit, because we're sort of on the cutting edge in asking these big questions. We're hoping to go perhaps where no movement has gone before, in creating a global movement that is truly historic, that's linking people in every country around the world with hope and inspiration and the belief that we can do better as a global society than we are right now. So, first of all, we all have to come to the recognition, I think, tonight, if I can leave us with 2 things. The good news, start with the bad news. The bad news is that we are part of a very inhumane global economy. We're inextricably linked to it as consumers, as workers, as people here in the United States. But the good news is, like I was saying, we're also, hopefully, after tonight, hopefully you'll see your part as well in this historic movement, this movement of movements that has been organized. Its leadership is coming from places from all different parts of the world. And here in the United States, I think we're discovering our role in creating a more just and humanable society. And it starts with building community. And that's the subject of my presentation tonight, is this topic of building community in an era of globalization, or corporate globalization. So you heard what got me into this. It was one lecture changed my life, a lecture about the World Bank, an institution that's been operating for over 55 years without much controversy, that's headquartered here in the United States along with the International Monetary Fund, based in Washington, D.C. You can walk right up to the headquarters of this just gigantic building made of concrete, steel, cement, and see inscribed on the wall, "We are creating a world free of poverty." That's the World Bank's motto, is inscribed right in this building that to me looked like a spaceship when I was looking up at it. And inside there are a number of economists and people from different development backgrounds who really believe that they are doing good for the world's poor. But in my experience, of what I've seen and the history and the legacy of this institution, of increased poverty, of displacing people. Last year alone, over 12 million people were displaced by the projects that the World Bank is funding in countries all over the world. It's a legacy now of an environmental catastrophe, as we're experiencing a crisis that's just quite unfathomable. Our system is really on a collision course with the natural limits and has in fact exceeded the natural limits of the environment. And that's just the scratch the surface of why I couldn't stay silent. I figured the World Bank had to change someday, and someday soon, hopefully, because people deserve better, and have been organizing ever since. And last April, there were approximately 25,000 people protesting in front of the World Bank and the IMF, April 2000. Before that, there were a few hundred people at their meeting, and before that, there were maybe 20 people in their meeting. So increasingly now, and over the past few years, these institutions have become incredibly controversial. But what they're doing isn't necessarily new, excuse me. What is globalization? What is this word that we're going to toss around a lot tonight? Well, it goes back perhaps 500 years to the era of colonialism, of imposing a system that transfers vast amount of wealth produced by people mainly from countries in what is now South America, Asia, Africa, colonies that were created that transferred wealth to places in Europe and the United States now. The system that we see today is an extension of this system of colonialism. That's why many people call it neocolonialism. Global apartheid, if you will, is the term that we're using this year in the mobilization for global justice in Washington, D.C., where we hope to see 50,000 people. It's a very unequal system where 86% of the world's resources are being consumed by a mere 20% of the world's population. And the elites that are running the system right now would have us believe that this is inevitable, that the global economy is a process that's just been evolving, and this is the inevitable conclusion of these processes. But there's nothing inevitable about this. The actors that are creating corporate globalization, are driving globalization, that are the engines of corporate globalization, have the names of World Bank, International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization, that received a warm welcome in Seattle a few years ago, where 50,000 people protested when that meeting occurred in Seattle. The regional trade agreements like NAFTA, Free Trade Area of the Americas, is now being planned for our future. The FTAA is the extension of NAFTA to all of the Western Hemisphere, would encompass 800 million people. Every one of us in the Western Hemisphere would be part of this pact, the FTAA. Well, how many people have heard about it? Just want to ask. All right. Well, look good. We're off to a good start, because the FTAA is something that we can change before it's put down in stone, because NAFTA has already been enough of a disaster, and I don't think we should be expanding this experiment. So these are some of the names of the institutions that are driving this current system in the global economy. And the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, in large part, are advancing an ideology. I'm not going to get too much into the specifics of all these institutions. I hope you'll continue your education and look into them and follow them. But they're part of an ideology that is best described by a number of words that we've heard: Reaganomics, laissez-faire. In Latin America, you'll hear it be called neoliberalismo, neoliberalism, free market economics, trickle down. Some people are now calling it trickle on theories. Whatever your name for it is, there are alternatives to this. There's been a mantra that we've been sold, a bag of goods, that this is the only way it works, that the free market system is the most efficient system that we can have. Well, there's nothing efficient about a system in which a child dies of poverty-related illnesses and diseases, easily prevented diseases, every 10 seconds on this planet. I don't want to live with that kind of efficiency. The alternatives that people are creating are challenging these institutions at their very core and are calling for a more just, humane, democratic, inclusive alternative. But before we begin to build these alternatives, let's make sure we know what we're fighting. And I want to just lay out about 6 key components of the free market ideology that we've heard over and over again about why I feel so strongly that we're transforming ourselves to perhaps what could be called a post-capitalist world, and why it's imperative that we do that not just morally, but environmentally. One of the biggest myths about these institutions is that they create more equality. Well, free market system has created just the opposite, increasing inequality. The gap between the rich and poor in the last 55 years has increased both within countries and between countries. Globally now, 80% of the world's population consumes just 14% of the resources. Nearly all goods and services are provided through market mechanisms. 90% of grain transactions are provided by market mechanisms. But yet people are starving, and more than 2 billion people live on $1 a day, which is not enough to put food on your table to survive. Massive hunger still exists in this world of tremendous wealth. Domestically, what's happened in our economy in the last 7 years since the NAFTA experiment? Wages have pretty much stagnated. You've got 1 in 5 children now growing up in poverty. The richest 1% of the population in the United States controls 90% of the property, stocks, bonds, real estate. Extreme amount of inequality in the United States. And that gap is continuing to grow. That gap between the rich and poor domestically is continuing to grow. As people are working harder for less. Just ask your grandparents. Remember when they could support a family? If a family of 4 could be supported by 1 wage earner. How many of us think that we'll be able to have a situation where one family member works and the other is able to raise the kids, which is more than a full-time job? How many of us believe that we can sustain our quality of life, our standard of living, without having to have 2 people working probably overtime? The United States, in fact, has just surpassed Japan in being the country with the least amount of vacation time by 3.5 weeks. We work longer and harder than any country in the world, and this is considered progress. Germany has 12 more weeks of vacation time. Why are we working harder for less? Well, in large part, we're transforming, and NAFTA's fueled this, from an industrialized society to a service-oriented society. 60-70% of the economy in the United States is service-oriented. Well, what happens when these service jobs are created? They're often in, what's the #1 employer, I think, in the United States besides the government? Manpower, Inc. Temporary jobs with no benefits, no security. Walmart, when Walmart comes to town, what kind of jobs are they providing? Are they providing living wage jobs? No, they're providing usually minimum wage jobs that will not support a family, so families end up having to work 2-3 jobs just to make ends meet. And what happens when Walmart comes to town? What happens to the local economy? Well, it goes down the tanks, it goes down the tubes, because this is the trend now, that globalization favors big corporations, larger and larger markets. The trends now being advanced by the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the WTO, the free trade agreements are creating immense global markets that corporations can take advantage of when they have power, when they have an economy of scale and the power to buy up, in the case of Walmart, mom and pop stores, send them out of business, and then raise the prices, or not invest in the community. When you spend $10 at Walmart, by 7 o'clock that night, 9 out of $10 is in a bank account in London or in Wall Street. That money is not coming back into the community. Over the long term, that is not a sustainable economy. Maybe in the short term, but not in the long term. You've just lost the diversity of a local economy that's been the backbone of the economic development here in the United States. So markets not automatically, by themselves, eliminate inequality. In fact, they do just quite the opposite. I was mentioning what's happened in their globalization. Who's really benefited is the multinational corporations that are able to take advantage of large international global markets. Out of the 100 largest economies now, 51 are corporations. Out of the 100 largest economies around the world, 51 are corporations. Corporations, multinational corporations, AT&T, GE, you name it. We could go down the line. Starbucks, Gap are my two favorites of the week to talk about. Have more power than most nation states. Their incomes are larger than countries like India or even China. These are gigantic multinational corporations that wield a tremendous amount of power and are therefore continuing this mantra of promoting free markets with the belief that they'll create more equality in the world. Well, they don't. The facts are in. Mantra number 2, or myth number 2, that the model that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund economists have been promoting, the model of achievement, the benchmark that they're measuring success by, is economic growth. You've heard it before, economic growth, GNP growth, increases in the gross national product. But market-driven growth are making things worse. In the last 40 years, since the 60s, according to every economic indicator, more investment has been had, more trade has increased. Economic growth in the global economy has increased. Production has increased. But has inequality gotten better or worse? It's gotten worse. Has environmental destruction gotten better or worse? Are we doing better at taking care of our environment? It's gotten worse. It's gotten way worse. Spirituality. What defines quality of life? Has that gotten better or worse? I would say that some of our spiritual lives could probably use some work in this society. The sense of community, things that we value, all these key indicators are in decline. So there's this fundamental problem in the way that we're measuring progress using the GNP. Well, what does the GNP count? It counts all the goods and services produced in a year in a country. It doesn't take into consideration what might be negative aspects of our economy. Maybe we shouldn't be defining as progress. Building more prisons. Is that something that we should count as a boon to the GNP? More crime, more accidents, more money spent on solving public health problems, fighting, tobacco companies, or addressing problems related to alcoholism or addiction, cleaning up the environment, having to pay the cost of pollution. This model, the GNP, this benchmark, doesn't measure nature. It doesn't take into consideration the value of nature. A tree standing in a forest has no value under the current system. It's not until you rip down that 10,000-year-old redwood tree and turn it into $30,000 worth of timber have you created progress in the eyes of the way that progress is being measured by the current global economy leaders. So we need a new indicator, a new indicator that would genuinely measure what people care about, what we value in our society, more time spent with our children, more time spent on things that building our community, more time spent investing in taking care of our environment and cleaning up our environment and protecting our environment for future generations. Until we create a new benchmark for progress, I think we'll be continuing to measure and count as benefits more of what we don't want and not enough of what we want. One example that's commonly thrown out when we talk about this GNP measurement tool is the Exxon Valdez, right? When the Exxon Valdez ran aground in Alaska, it spewed oil all over the Sound, caused innumerable damage. Well, guess what? The GNP in Alaska shot up. That was a boon to the economy. Well, we shouldn't be measuring disasters like that as indicators of success. something wrong with our basic measurements of progress. And yet the World Bank and the IMF continue to hold countries accountable to those measurements. So the other, number 2 in my list of 6 points I'm going to talk through tonight, or number 3 actually, is that the standards that the World Bank and the IMF are holding countries to are totally hypocritical. They're forcing countries to quote-unquote develop along lines that any industrial country never followed. The agenda they're promoting is a cookie-cutter approach to the development model that the World Bank and IMF is imposing on the mass majority of the population in the world. They rely on structural adjustment policies to carry out the agenda. These SAPs. How many of you heard about SAPs? Well, we've got a few people who've heard about structural adjustment policies, but the realities that people are living with under these structural adjustment policies on a daily basis is what's creating protests in Argentina as we speak, with 100,000 people plus are marching in Argentina. A general strike was called recently in South Africa. Why are these people in countries all around the world, why are they protesting structural adjustment policies? Well, they do things like require governments to cut their social spending, to shrink their budgets, cut the education and health care budgets. Who are the first people fired usually when that happens? It's usually women. Impacts on women are enormous under structural adjustment policies. Quality of life for women goes way down. The World Bank and the IMF require poor countries to pay what are called user fees, small fees for health and education. Most of us, at least I did, went through public school without having to pay a fee. We had universal education. I think we're still working for universal health care to guarantee that everyone in this country, this wealthy country of ours, has access to basic health care. We've got some work to do there. 43 million Americans lack health care. It's pretty abominable. But the World Bank and the IMF is continuing to require the poorest people in the world to pay a small fee when they go to a clinic or when they go to school. What happens when you require a family to start paying, a poor family that's living on $2, literally could be $2 a day, $10 a week? The young women are the first to be told they can't go to school. Women in these countries where SAPs have been implemented, young women, young girls, are forced into prostitution, are forced to work in sweatshops. They're not able to have access to education. Usually it might be one student that might be lucky enough. Street children in Zambia, for example. As soon as user fees were imposed, 66% of them were back out on the streets. They didn't have the income. Structural adjustment policy also require countries to open up their marketplaces, to liberalize, to open up. Well, the United States had tariffs and protections for our industries for decades to ensure that our farmers could be the most competitive farmers in the world. But for poor farmers, they're seeing their access to credit shrink completely. They're seeing their access to resources from the government, to banking loans, to low-interest loans, shrink completely. Food security has been severely compromised by these policies. NAFTA, for example, in Mexico, NAFTA and the World Bank, IMF, these programs go hand in hand. Trade liberalization is a key component both of the World Bank, IMF policies and of the trade agreements, obviously. In Mexico, when Mexico was forced to start accepting a large amount of corn, the government reduced its supports to farmers by 90%, even though 49% of the people in Mexico live in rural areas. In 1996, after Mexico had increased its dependency on imported U.S. corn, there was a shrinkage of corn supply, and there was not enough corn to be exporting in mass to Mexico. As a consequence, you saw 1 in 5 children malnourished because they were no longer purchasing or growing food for local consumption. The World Bank and IMF has preached a shift from growing food to support your local society, your people, to growing food for the export market. And now we wonder why the commodity prices are at an all-time historic low. It's in large part because the policies of the World Bank and the IMF and these structural adjustment policies required countries to be exporting products instead of providing food for their own people. Korea is often held up as an example, success story. Well, Korea did not follow the free market mantras of the World Bank and the IMF for the first 30 or 40 years. It wasn't until the 90s that they finally followed the dictates of the World Bank and IMF and opened up their economy. Before that, there was a high state intervention in setting policy, and setting trade policy, and setting policies and priorities for the government's involvement in incubating key industries. Well, in the 90s, when Korea was forced to open up and integrate into the global economy, in its financial sector in particular, hot money, investment money, rolled in and it rolled out right again. In 1997, what happened? Does anyone remember what happened in 1997? Asian economic crisis. Inevitability? Absolutely not. This was in large part because of the doctrines and the medicines that were preached and prescribed to the countries in Southeast Asia and South Asia. In Korea, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund is better known for IMF, I am fired. It's what it's known there in the streets, because they saw for the first time security, job security was eliminated, it was deregulated, was tossed out during the crisis. The IMF told Korea to export its way out of the crisis. As a consequence, they began selling en masse, dumping a lot of their products into the United States markets. What happened here when that happened? Was importing the steel, cheap steel from Korea. 10,000 steel workers that had been probably trimmed down as much as they possibly can were thrown out of work and out of business. Jobs here in the United States are directly tied to the policies that the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have been preaching. And for the last 20 years, I think here in the United States, we've definitely been following more and more of this export-oriented model, seeing the price supports eliminated, a lot of the protections for our farmers. Under NAFTA, what's happened to the ag sector under NAFTA? It seems as though that most of the members of Congress here seem to think it's a good idea because they're supporting NAFTA expansion. But according to a new report, that's the executive summary, which is out on the table, called Down on the Farm, incomes for farmers have been eroding. Farmers have been pushed out of business now 7 times faster after NAFTA than the period before NAFTA. The prices for corn and wheat and grain and beef are all shrinking to the tune of 20, 30, 40% of what they were being paid before NAFTA. The exports to Mexico and Canada have been growing at a lot slower than the imports from Mexico and Canada. No wonder there are so many farms going out of business. There's someone that is making a lot of money off of the agricultural sector, and it's the large multinational corporations, Cargill, Monsanto, ADM, that are now able to control the production, the whole supply chain, and are able to set the price and fix the price. So at a time when farmers are going out of business at an unprecedented rate, multinational corporations are getting the lion's share of the profits. And Mexico hasn't benefited either. There's an estimate now that approximately 15 million farmers have been pushed off their land in Mexico. One of the provisions of NAFTA required Mexican government to dismantle a system that was put in place during the revolution 80 years ago to guarantee that farmers would not lose their land if prices went up, if banks, if interest rates ran up. This was the Ejido system. It was also a system of communal land ownership. Well, that's been dismantled now. And for the first time in 80 years, you've seen hundreds of thousands of farmers, and Mexican farmers, pushed off their land into migration, into immigration to the United States, looking for a way just to simply make ends meet. And that's the legacy now of NAFTA. And in the ag industry, in the agricultural sector, and certainly people are fighting hard to make sure it's not expanded around the hemisphere in the form of the free trade area of the Americas. Markets undermine democracy. This is the one thing that's just been shocking me. The Bush administration has been using a slogan now to promote the free trade area of the Americas. They're sort of grasping at straws and have been saying that the FTAA will enhance democracy, that these policies now will expand democracy. Well, the experience of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, NAFTA, has been, in the WTO, the World Trade Organization, these are the most anti-democratic type of policies imaginable. There's no wonder that their impacts then as well of their policies is to undermine democracy and increase corruption. How does the World Bank and the IMF operate, first of all, the World Bank and International Monetary Fund? Are they a democratic, open system where one country has a vote, everyone has an equal share in the voting power? Nope. It's more like shareholders of a corporation. The more money you put in, the more power you have. So the United States, for example, has the most power in these institutions, as well as the other industrialized, wealthy countries. They're the ones calling the shot in the World Bank and the IMF, the institutions that are supposed to be helping to end poverty in countries around the world. And that's why we often remind people that decisions being made in Washington and Wall Street will never eliminate poverty, and the actual function of these institutions is to ally global elites in countries in the third world, in the global south, with global elites in Washington and Wall Street, to make them more accountable to the financial interests of Wall Street and the interests of multinational corporations than their own people. This is what the World Bank and the IMF does. When you sign up with the International Monetary Fund, and when a country is forced to sign up with the International Monetary Fund, it's like signing up with a loan shark. No one wants to sign up with the loan shark, but that's what countries are forced to do over and over again, because the current market system is not providing alternatives. The World Trade Organization. Now here's an institution that was created in 1995. It was the extension of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which existed 40 some odd years ago. The WTO is perhaps one of the most powerful institutions on earth ever created. It's headquartered in Geneva and is able to have all three aspects of government. It's sort of the precursor to a global state, a global government. It is able to write the rules of the global economy. It governs the rules of the global economy by setting up a tribunal that is able to have the power to enforce the rules, as well as the executive branch. Over 500 people work in the offices of the WTO. Well, are the decisions that the WTO making, are they open and democratic? Well, no. The WTO has the power to challenge local, state, federal laws and declare them barriers to trade. It has the power to undermine democratically passed laws. And it has already yielded this power. The first law challenge within the World Trade Organization's court system was what? It was the Clean Air Act. Venezuelan oil companies said that our Clean Air Act, which is put in place to try to stop problems like childhood asthma and clean up our air and improve air quality, was challenged as a barrier to free trade, and the U.S. government was forced to figure out how to align its policies with the WTO's mandate to either repeal the law or face penalties. The World Trade Organization has recently heard a case involving the country of Burma, a military dictatorship, where the International Labor Organization has agreed that, yes, they're using slavery. Corporations like Unocal have benefited from slave labor being used when the military junta comes into a village and says, all of you here will be now working for Unocal to build this pipeline. Well, countries or cities here throughout the United States, it's like San Francisco and even the state of Massachusetts, began a way of showing international solidarity, of responding to the calls from the democratically elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi, who's been under house arrest for 7 years, to implement a boycott and to not do any new foreign investment with the Burmese dictatorship. Well, the state of Massachusetts, do you think it was rewarded for its leadership in human rights? No, some of the largest corporations in the European Union and Japan brought this case to the WTO, where it was about to be heard before it was struck down by domestic courts, although they alluded to the fact that it had been heard in the WTO. There is this hearing now going through the WTO as an example of how this is an issue of international foreign policy that the state had no right to regulate in. Well, this is the same policy that helped to bring down apartheid in South Africa. This is the same strategy that people used in municipalities and universities all around the country to challenge an unjust, racist system to ensure that our corporations weren't propping up and facilitating an apartheid regime. There was a call for divestment, and municipalities passed these local divestment policies. It's likely that Nelson Mandela would still be in jail if the WTO was able to continue what it's doing today 5 to 10 years ago, or in the 80s when this battle was being waged. The WTO saw that this was an effective grassroots strategy, wanted to make sure it wasn't replicated, it wasn't used again, to try to hold multinational corporations accountable to human rights issues. Markets versus nature and public health. The World Bank and the IMF were created perhaps during a time when there really were no conceivable limits to the global ecosystems of the world. But now we're living in a time when every major ecosystem in the planet is in decline, in large part because of the debt crisis, which the World Bank and the IMF responded to by saying, if you've got forests, cut them down, liquidate them as quickly as possible to repay debt to the World Bank, the IMF, and international creditors for projects that really never benefited countries in the first place. If you've got fisheries, overfish the stocks. If you've got resources, turn them into cash as quickly as possible. Countries are now spending sometimes up to 30% of their annual budgets on debt service. It's estimated that the wildlife population in marine environments has declined by 1/3 in the last 2 decades. These are rates that are not sustainable. It's estimated that it would take another 2 Earths if we were to sustain the same standard of living here for every person on the planet. We've exceeded the natural limits of the ecosystem by close to 30% in practically every ecosystem. But the institutions of the World Bank and the IMF are barely taking this into consideration. The World Bank now is doing some environmental assessments of its policies, but it's continuing to spend, for example, money on promoting unsustainable technologies, fossil fuels, for example, coal-fired power plants. A few years ago, there was a study done that said that the World Bank was likely to be funding projects that within 10 years would be emitting more fossil fuels in the atmosphere than the current levels of output. They're spending more money on fossil fuel projects, 25 times more money than on sustainable technologies. We have the solution to climate problems. We're just not implementing them. We have the technologies to move towards solar, energy, small hydroelectrical. But the World Bank and the IMF is not doing that. Why? Because multinational corporations don't profit from those industries, from those solutions. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, now is that an institution that's taken into consideration the fact that we're having an enormous environmental crisis, unprecedented environmental crisis? No, I've already mentioned one case, the Clean Air Act that was struck down. Every time the World Trade Organization tribunals have to rule on whether nature, is it going to be nature or the interests of multinational corporations, they've ruled in the interests of multinational corporations. A couple of years ago, there was a case brought to protect dolphins, a labeling on our tuna. You can go to the market now and hopefully you might see labeling there. The World Trade Organization declared that this type of labeling was a barrier to free trade, that you cannot discriminate on a product on the basis of which it's made, on the way it's made. Sea turtles, probably one of the most ancient species. Indigenous people have a myth that the world was created on the back of a sea turtle. It's the creation myth for many indigenous societies. Well, what kind of respect are we paying to the sea turtle? Well, the sea turtles are going extinct and will likely go extinct in our lifetimes. The United States enacted the Endangered Species Act to hopefully preserve what's left of the sea turtle species. The World Trade Organization decided that Endangered Species Act, those protections for sea turtles, was a barrier to free trade. Nature and the WTO are clearly on a collision course. An area that's gotten to be more and more controversial now is an area of intellectual property rights. The WTO has a domain now, not of just products, trade in products like agriculture and automobiles, but in almost every aspect of our life, of our society, including the way patents are doled out. Well, there's been a movement now to say that you cannot patent genes. You cannot patent, for example, genes that are taken from indigenous populations. You cannot patent the heritage of mankind, seeds, for example. Basmati rice now has been patented by a Texas corporation. A sacred tree in India, the neem tree, sparked an incredible movement in India to call for a campaign to stop the patenting of life. Well, the World Trade Organization is what's fueling actually a monopoly system of patent rights, extending what was 13 years here for patents to 20 years internationally. Why are drug prices so high? Why isn't there a flourishing generic drug industry? India, Thailand, Brazil are all producing generic drugs that cost a small fraction of what they cost for American consumers. In large part, this is because of the agenda being pushed by the drug industry, along with the agribusiness corporations and the giant seed corporations, for control over drug pricing and monopoly patent rights through the World Trade Organization. The last point I'll make is one of a bit spiritual. Don't mind me getting a little spiritual here. A question of, are these theories, these economic models that are being advanced by the World Bank, IMF, WTO, enriching our spiritual lives? What does every religion in the world preach? Does it preach amass more wealth, amass more stuff? No, it preaches love one another, respect one another, justice. But this is not what the teachings and not what the lessons are in the theories that are being advanced for the World Bank and the IMF and the World Trade Organization. One of the fundamental questions being raised by this movement is, do we want to have a society, do we want communities driven by money values, make more money, or life values? The social crisis and the inequality that exists in the environmental crisis is likely giving rise to this third crisis, this crisis in our spiritual lives. And the corporations, what do they tell you? How are you going to solve the void that exists? Shopping mall. We're preached over 3,000 advertisements a day on average people are receiving. I got about 10,000 on this campus already today. Buy more stuff. Well, no amount of goods is going to give you the type of self-worth and meaning that a movement for social justice, a movement for community can create. Yet this is not what's being preached by the global elites through these institutions. The Cree Indians understood this well, and they had a saying here that there were more important things in life than money. Only when the last tree has died and the last river has been poisoned and the last fish has been caught will we realize that we cannot eat money. So I think we should take a few lessons from the Cree. People have been posing this question, do we want to live by money values or life values, in movements around the world? It's been a call to democratize the global economy, saying that everyone should have a voice. In fact, the most impacted communities should have a voice in the way economic decisions are made. That it shouldn't be left to unaccountable institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO. People are demanding a voice in the way that investment gets channeled. It's a question over who's going to benefit from investment resources. Is it going to get to the grassroots, or is it going to be channeled through the World Bank and the IMF? There's a movement called for microcredit. An alternative to the World Bank would be a system that doles out small loans in forms of $100, $200. This has already proven incredibly successful at eliminating poverty, a model called the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. Here in the United States, there's been one of the largest growing sectors of investing is socially responsible investing. Investors are saying that, yes, we want to put conditions on where our money is invested. We don't want to see our pension fund money going to support tobacco companies or the military defense spending. We have a choice in where investment gets spent. There's been a campaign that was launched last year and has now been joined by over 30 institutions, including a number of cities and universities, to boycott World Bank bond. The way that World Bank raises its money is a large part on the bond market. So you can actually buy World Bank bonds. Your church, your institution, for example, might actually own World Bank bonds. Well, this is a model now it's a campaign that was called a strategy by representatives of movements in the global south to work with people here in the United States. A number of students have taken up this campaign to limit the amount of money that's going to World Bank bonds, the World Bank, as a way to squeeze it and hopefully transform this institution out of existence to become a truly democratic and open and inclusive institution for the global economy, for the global society. This movement could be called grassroots internationalism or grassroots globalization, globalization from the bottom up. It's a movement of movements that includes things like the corporate accountability movement. How many of you heard about the fight against sweatshops? Yeah, good. I joined the staff at Global Exchange on the day that we launched a campaign, a lawsuit actually, on major retailers in Saipan. Anyone heard of Saipan or know where it is? It's a U.S. territory, sort of like Puerto Rico in the far western Pacific, where there's literally a system of indentured servitude. Workers pay recruitment fees close to $2,000 to sometimes $5,000. Workers from China, Thailand, India, Philippines travel to Saipan, a U.S. territory, in hopes that they'll be able to earn a decent amount of income. But often it takes them up to a year or two to even repay the recruitment fee that they had to pay, that they had to borrow from their families in order to get that job in the first place. During that time, if they happen to get pregnant or get fired or demand a better working conditions or an end to the psychological torture that exists in most of these sweatshop factories and most of the places where our clothes come from, they're stuck high and dry with a huge fee. It's a system literally of indentured servitude. 45,000 garment workers are working behind barracks, behind military-style barracks, to produce clothes, and these are the new jobs that are being created in the global economy. Well, we've been campaigning against the Gap, demanding that they settle the suit as one of the largest retailers involved in propping up the system in Saipan. The reason that the corporations have flocked there is because they're able to sew "Made in the USA" on there, but no way do these conditions resemble anything that we would think exists on U.S. soil. They also are able to get around tariff and quotas standards, so they're able to import as much as they can, as much as they possibly can make and produce on this small island into the United States. So it's been a system there. It's sort of like a colony that's been booming. Well, the lawsuit has been settled now by a number of the retailers. Gap isn't one of them, so we've continued our grassroots pressure, also to demand that Gap pay living wage. Here in the United States, I know that there are efforts as well to pass living wage initiatives. I believe Manhattan Alliance for Peace and Justice is one of the groups that is working hard to ensure that workers here are being paid a living wage, because the minimum wages have not kept up with inflation, have not kept up with the cost of living. So there's an effort now to link this and ensure that as we fight for global justice, we're also fighting for equality in our communities. And that's something that we have to ask ourselves is, where is the global economy hitting home? Where are we being impacted locally by the global economy? Well, I walked through your bookstore this afternoon and saw most of the clothes are being made in Philippines, in Mexico, and Pakistan, a number also in the United States. A number of the parts were made here in the United States and then shipped to Mexico. Well, this is the power. I want to tell you a story real quickly about it. The power of grassroots internationalism, of the student anti-sweatshop movement, United Students Against Sweatshop. In January, there was one of the largest factories in Mexico in the garment industry, a factory called Kukdong, stopped paying their workers what they were owed, and the workers went out on strike. Predominantly young women, 14, 15, 16-year-old women, were out on strike, and the company and the government sent in thugs and beat up these women and hospitalized a number of them. Well, within days, United Students Against Sweatshops and the effort that they've been organizing around the Workers' Rights Consortium sent a delegation of faculty members and students directly to this factory, Puebla. They produced a report. The factory is making products for Nike and for student bookstores, just like yours here. And on Saturday, I was able to hear from one of these workers directly that an independent union had been established in the factory, that people were back at work, that their jobs had been returned, and that they had hope that this factory would respect workers' rights. Because for the first time, there's been an independent union created in this factory. This is an incredible precedent that's been established, and it came about because of the student movement, the student activism that's been sweeping across the country in the last decade. It's already starting to make a huge difference in the lives of workers around the world. The global justice movement is, as I like to call it, is organizing against the institutions I've been talking about today, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization. Plans are being made to appropriately greet the WTO when they move to Qatar for their next meeting. Last year, 2 years ago, in 1999, they met in Seattle in November 9th through 13th. They're meeting in a country called Qatar. It's in the Persian Gulf. They don't allow freedom of expression. They don't have an independent media. There's a reason you've never heard of them. Right? And yet this is where the global economy, the World Trade Organization, is being built. It's being built on a foundation of repression and lack of freedom and lack of basic political rights, freedom of speech, so on. Well, there's plans for a fisher fleet to come from India and travel through the Persian Gulf, sort of a Noah's Ark of social movements, representative of social movements from all over the world, to be there to appropriately greet Qatar. They can run, but they can't hide, is sort of the theme. And there's a call that's gone out for folks to get sick with the Qatar flu and to stay home and do actions and do organizing and do education around what the World Trade Organization is and what their designs are and what their plans are. One of the major parts of their agenda in November is to expand an agreement that would cover services. Well, what's a service? I've heard it described as anything that you can't drop on your foot. General Agreement on Trade and Services, the GATS, there's a booklet outside, but it encompasses things like education. Education isn't, in the eyes of the WTO and the designers of the WTO, a forum for raising a next generation of educating our citizenry. It's a market. In fact, it's a huge market, a $2.5 trillion market that corporations want to turn into profit. Increasingly, our schools are being commodified. Our schools are being commercialized. Our minds, our open minds, where we should be getting received with knowledge and information, are being turned into arenas to create good consumers and workers and not raise these kinds of questions. That's the agenda for the World Trade Organization, as well as healthcare. Healthcare is increasingly seen as a huge industry. Water services, privatization of water, is a big agenda now that's being fought all around the world. One of the sort of the success stories of movements against and efforts against World Bank-led projects is a story that's been told now in the last year, resulting from a movement in Bolivia where some of the world's poorest peasants fought against Bechtel Corporation when Bechtel came in and took over the water supply, immediately raised payments, raised costs to almost 200%. So families were having to decide between paying for water or paying for food or buying food. That's not a decision that people should have to make. Well, that's what happened when Bechtel took over the water supply. And so Bolivia, indigenous people, women's movements, students, teamed together, and they actually were successful in kicking Bechtel out and reclaiming their control over the water system in Bolivia. It's a huge victory that people have been celebrating as just one of the ways that through international solidarity, through the grassroots movements, are making victories in the name of preserving human rights and preserving local control and preserving the environment for future generations. The big fight right now around NAFTA expansion is being waged within the battle of fast track. Hopefully, many of you have heard about fast track. Another key example of just how these institutions are undemocratic. How are trade policies made in the United States? Is it in a forum like this where you can come and testify and provide your ideas and your concerns as a farmer or a small business owner or a worker or as a student about what you want in a trade agreement or what you don't want in a trade agreement? No, they're made through a series of industry sector advisory committees that have direct input into the process. Those committees are made up by representative multinational corporations. That's the committees that give direct input into the executive branch. And now under fast track, although the Constitution says that Congress should have a key role in setting trade policy, fast track delegates this role to the executive branch, in this case the Bush administration. In 1997, Clinton administration pushed for fast track because that's the way that NAFTA and the World Trade Organization came to be in the first place, through this mechanism that's very unique only to trade issues, that's been only used 5 times, despite the fact there's been hundreds of trade agreements written and passed and discussed and debated. It's used to pass these very controversial agreements that are striking out at the heart of democracy, that are reaching into the way that we want to set policy in the interest of public health or the environment. So fast track now is up for debate, and grassroots fair trade coalitions are working hard in every state in the country to ensure that trade issues remain in the House and the representatives in Congress, where they can get thoroughly reviewed and we can develop a more democratic, inclusive process for coming up with our future trade policies. So we have our work cut out for us, and certainly people are organizing now for Washington in just a few weeks. There'll likely be tens of thousands of people in front of the World Bank International Monetary Fund calling under the slogan, "Another World is Possible," that we've adopted from a meeting that took place last year in Brazil. Every year there's a meeting actually in Geneva, Switzerland, in a ski resort called the World Economic Forum. I don't know how many of you have heard of it, but it's similar to the G8, where representatives of large corporations and presidents and trade ministers get together and sort of have discussions about what they see as for the future in the global economy, what kind of new policies they'd like to see enacted. Well, people started to organize a counterform to that called the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre, Brazil. They expected about 2,000 people there. And in fact, they had 10,000 people there. And this year, they're expecting 100,000 people for a social forum, for a conference, for a series of workshops and discussions and ideas that are hopefully forming the foundation for a new global system. And this is where the slogan of "A New World is Possible" is coming from. World Social Forum, that's something to keep your eye out for in early January. So the discussion, though, of how to localize the global movement. This is a discussion of building sustainable communities. There's alternatives that exist right here in your city. What's an alternative to free trade? Fair trade. Fair trade coffee, for example, is a system that for the first time, it's the first commodity brought to the United States where consumers have a choice between buying coffee that is creating a cycle of poverty or coffee that is providing a fair price for farmers, $1.26 per pound compared to 50 cents per pound, which is what coffee is going for in the commercial markets. Fair trade, I visited some of the communities in Nicaragua. The farmers there are organized into cooperatives. They're able to invest in building health clinics. They were able to invest in building a school. They were able to invest in building a water purification system that drastically reduced infant mortality rate. Well, you too can invest in a brighter future for coffee farmers by simply choosing to buy fair trade as an alternative, fair trade coffee as an alternative to free trade. And I understand that it's sold here at the grocery store Mercado and Java, which I've...
People's Grocery.
People's Grocery. It's just an example, hopefully, of what we're evolving toward, ensuring that the clothes that we buy and are wearing, the food supply, coffee that we drink, are democratically controlled, are controlled in a way that benefits those producers, that doesn't create this cycle of poverty. What are some other examples of what can we do in our daily lives? Where's our money invested? Do we have a bank account with Citigroup, or is there a local alternative, perhaps in the community credit union, that might guarantee and provide loans to this community rather than large loans that go to further environmental destruction, environmentally destructive projects like Citigroup is the #1 funder of rainforest destruction. There's just an infinite amount of things that you can do to start to begin to create perhaps what might be called a fair trade zone in your community. And that's, I think, in large part what people in this room are starting to think about and to work on and figure out where the global economy connects with local initiatives for equality and democracy and justice and basic human rights. And I want to end here with just a quote from a young South African woman that spoke a couple days ago at a Job with Justice conference that I attended in Cleveland. And she said, let me kindly remind you that you people here, she's talking as a South African woman to an audience of mainly Americans, you people have an incredible amount of power. You have a special kind of power because you live in the superpower that controls the world. And it's something that just touched me to my very heart, that we as citizens in the country where the World Bank and International Monetary Fund are headquartered, where these agreements like NAFTA are being created, we have a certain responsibility, not just to our own communities, but to a global society. And we're discovering how to reclaim our power and rebuild communities and restore the earth. And I just want to thank you for coming tonight and exploring some of these ideas with me.
I want to thank you for your talk, and I want to say that I think you've just witnessed a graphic demonstration of the problem here at K-State. Many of us in the room are educators, and we've been with this institution for a number of years. Some of us are native Kansans, and some of us, like myself, are not. And, I heard you trying to make appeals to the students through using the word farmers. And I think that, and I tried that too. And the students at Kansas State University, by and large, do not come from farm families. They come from ranch families. They come from wealth. And it's very difficult for them to hear what you're trying to tell them. And it's very difficult for them to hear what I try to tell them. It's very threatening to them. And I just want to thank you because I know that you probably touched at least 1 or 2 people, maybe 10 or 20. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about the anti-sweatshop movement because when I show films about that in my women's studies classes, some of the students are quite interested in it. And if you could say a little bit more about that for the students that are still here.
Great. Well, I can remember when after college I was starting to organize around the World Bank and the IMF, and it's pretty hard, right? It's like, how do you connect this to people's daily lives? And we did that through a sweatshop, through work at during the Christmas shopping season in front of Nike at the time, or in front of Disney, actually. They're right next to each other. It makes it convenient. Right in Union Square. Disney Corporation at the time was paying its CEO something like $30,000 an hour if you count up stock options, and the workers in Haiti were being paid about 18 cents an hour, and they had asked for our help. They were trying to organize in their factories. They were mostly young women who weren't able to feed their children, and a lot of the children were becoming street children, and they were very concerned. Haiti's one of the poorest countries in the hemisphere. And we started this campaign against Disney, and one of the demands was for them to pull out of Burma, to agree not to continue production in Burma. And it was just a few weeks, but it was during a sensitive time. And they actually pulled out of Burma. They called us up one day and said, we will agree to this one concern here about pulling out of Burma. We had teamed up with a local factory across the bay near Oakland, where workers were making rubber stamps for Disney. And they were mostly Latino workers who had just seen their wage system go from a salary or an hourly rate to a piecemeal rate where they got paid per little stamp that they made. And as a consequence, there was real escalation of the psychological pressure of working on an assembly line. You have to make 100 more pieces. You have to make 200 more pieces, 500 more pieces. Keep driving away at them. And they went on strike to improve their working conditions right during the Christmas shopping season as well. And it was probably one of the most heartwarming examples of being able to fight for workers' rights and equality locally and globally at the same time, because the workers from Emeryville came to the picket line in Union Square with their families, and we joined their picket line in this little city near Oakland. And they won their strike. They won their demands from Disney Corporation, or the contractor that Disney was accountable to. And it gave me the first sense that this is definitely a place where you can make a lot of difference. Nike Corporation has been a target of an enormous amount of grassroots pressure, consumer-based campaigns. Student groups around the country have started to question the way that Nike enters into business with universities like K-State here, and the type of agreements that are written. Nike promotes, just do it, and all these advertisements about young women athletes, for example, empowered and healthy and achieving, great athletic achievements. But if you look at their workers, where they're coming, the conditions that they were operating in, and many of them were getting sick within just a few years because of the toxicity of the shoe glue. There was beatings. The factories in Indonesia are guarded by, military-style armed guards to sort of intimidate the workers and create this climate of repression and ensure that no worker would dare to speak out or dare to demand maybe 2 bathroom breaks or a longer lunch hour because they needed to recuperate. So the campaign against Nike made some immediate gain within just a few years. Nike started to switch all of its shoe glues to a less toxic glue. It set up a number of monitoring systems in its factories where monitors that most of them worked for the corporation could come and ensure that Nike's code of conduct was being enforced. And Nike started to clean up some of the worst abuses. Clearly, the global corporation operating in over 30 countries in the world, they don't have a firm grasp of what's happening in most of their factories on a daily basis. And as a consequence, stories like the one I told about the Cookdong workers being beat up on the picket line is far too common. It's not very often actually that we hear about them right away in the way that we did with this case in Mexico. But when we do, we're able to jump into action. And the calls for the sweatshop movement have been to pay living wages. Often part of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank's conditions is to set the minimum wage lower than what a family can survive on. So the minimum wage are set low in order to attract factories like Nike to come. So the idea of a living wage is a calculation per country that would guarantee that a family of 4 could support their child's education, maybe have a little bit of time off, vacation saved for the future. We're not talking like a big income here by any means. It's just what it says, a living wage provides a certain amount of security. Financial security is actually a human right, as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The other demands have been for independent monitoring. This is where Nike has fallen up short. You can't have a situation of the fox guarding the hen house, which is what happens when you have your own monitors. We want independent monitors, community monitors, people from religious background or different kinds of background to be able to go into a factory and do a quick check to make sure that there's no abuses going on. The Clinton administration set up something called the Fair Labor Association, FLA, that was an attempt to bring together industry representatives with labor representatives with NGO or civil society representatives to talk about creating a system to end sweatshop abuses internationally. And the Fair Labor Association sort of kept reducing its, reneging on its commitments to a real enforceable labor rights, worker rights system, and consequently Unite dropped out, the union dropped out, and workers and students started to form an alternative called the Workers' Rights Consortium. So that's now what's been the subject of much of the worker-led campaigns, or the student-led campaigns, is to get universities to sign on to this Workers' Rights Consortium that would start to implement a code of conduct and a monitoring system for the clothes that are made, for example, right here in the student union. And this is now one of the major goals of the student anti-sweatshop movement. Groups like United Students Against Sweatshops are campaigning to get more and more universities and groups signed up with the Workers' Rights Consortium, and hopefully it'll have lasting impacts. But usually, we can pretty much be assured that until there are real enforcement mechanisms in place globally, that these abuses will continue to happen, and that the pressure to lower wages and abuse workers will continue to grow. It's often referred to as the race to the bottom in global working standards. So we do need a universal, systemic-wide system for monitoring, and that's still yet to come to total fruition. I think the Workers' Rights Consortium is headed in that direction.
Ms. Beck, I know I can only speak for myself, but I'd like to first begin by saying that you had an excellent speech. I thought it was pretty well organized and pretty well done. Having said that, last year on May 3rd, 2001, as part of the Landing Lecture Series, we had a guest, was the former president of Mexico, I think Ernesto Zedillo. He was the president from 1994 to 2000. Now, he spoke very adamantly in favor of the free trade area of Americas, and he believed in more liberalization of free trade and trade policies. You said that Mexico was specifically hurt by NAFTA and was damaged irreplaceably. It seemed like it was the way to me. Why, if this was the case, why would Ernesto Zedillo, and I believe even the current president of Mexico, Vicente Fox, both believe in free trade and want to increase the problems of the United States? If that is true, why do they want to continue this? Why do they want to continue hurting their country?
It's a very good question. Well, I mentioned that in large part these institutions are serving to create alliances between global elites like Mr. Zedillo and Fox that were both educated, I believe, in institutions of higher education here in the United States. I believe Zedillo or Fox went to Yale, or Zedillo went to Yale, I forget which, went to Yale and which went to University of Chicago. And they bought into the same ideology and the same belief that if you give multinational corporations as much power as they want, as much abilities as they want to trade freely, that in the long run the countries will benefit. The elites in these countries do benefit. Mexico has the third largest number of billionaires after U.S. and Germany or Japan. Mexico has the largest number of billionaires, something like 11 or 13 billionaires. And there's incredible inequality there, and they're fighting to have a real democracy. So the citizens' movements in Mexico have long opposed these policies. In fact, in 1994, Zapatistas launched, the day NAFTA went into effect, Zapatistas went to war against their government, Mexican government, saying that they're not going to agree to abide by these policies. But the governments are still fundamentally corrupt. They're not accountable to the people, the mass majority of the people. They're accountable to Washington and Wall Street, the peso crisis in the early 90s, and the way that the World Bank and IMF and the U.S. Trade Representative and the U.S. Treasurer stepped in to manufacture a bailout package, forced Mexico into this series of policies, into NAFTA, further entrenched, demanded that in exchange for rescuing the economy, which at the time was plummeting. The peso was devaluating, and people were seeing their savings evaporate overnight. So they were in a state of crisis, and they are getting further and further entrenched in the system. Zedillo and Fox, like I said, they have an economist background. Fox was the president of Coca-Cola in Mexico. They're firm believers that multinational corporations will do what's in the best interest of society. And despite the track record of NAFTA, Mexico continues to champion a lot of these free trade policies around the world. But they would be very hard-pressed in a meeting like this to really answer to the successes that Mexico has experienced. They might point to a number of the jobs that's been created in the border regions and the factories. And we said this might be a good start in terms of job creation, but the number of jobs that have been displaced by NAFTA far exceed the number of jobs created.
I'd like to thank you for coming first. My question is a little bit more of a local thing, and it's something that's been going on here at K-State as well as around the nation, and that is colleges losing their institutional integrity in order to maintain an adequate level of funding, and that K-State has a multi-million-dollar contract with Pepsi, and the College of Agriculture and several of the other colleges have multi-million-dollar research contracts with ADM, with Cargill, with Monsanto, other huge corporations. And at the same time, our funding from the state keeps getting cut to smaller and smaller levels. And how can institutions of education maintain their integrity while still getting required funding that they need just to operate and just to stay afloat and just to continue a quality academic record.
Well, this is, I think, what's happening to our education system is sort of the domestic example of structural adjustment policies. You know, for the past decade or so, we've experienced great economic growth in the economy, expansion in the economy, but where has been the money to go to build up the social safety net, to build up our education systems? It hasn't happened. It's, in fact, the budgets that governments have allocated seem to be shrinking to state colleges and public school systems around the country. It seems like there's a direct assault on the educational system by not adequately funding these institutions. And that for our government, that's our job, is to demand a bigger budget for education. That's our job as an active citizenry, in a democracy, to demand a reprioritization of funding. Because the money has to be there somewhere. I mean, if we're spending $500 billion a year on a military defense budget in a time of peace, and President Bush has plans now to build this enormously expensive missile defense fund, there's definitely money to be spent. It's a question of where is it going to be spent. If it's not being spent in our schools, we're not investing in our future. And I think that is an issue that's deserving of a massive grassroots campaign, because change is made through social pressure. It's made through social movements, and this kind of question of priorities for educational spending, I think, has to be thrown back at our elected officials to demand a bigger budget for K-State, so that public universities don't have to go begging to multinational corporations like Pepsi for income. I mean, I just heard that there are very few grants even being offered now, that most of the research is being funded through contracts. Well, how are we deciding what's valuable research if we haven't even studied it yet? But multinational corporations have their agenda, and that's what they're contracting for. So there's real arguments to be made about the decline in the quality of education, the sacrifices that are being made when you have to turn over your programs to the interests of corporations. And that battle needs to be waged by people on campus, by faculty that have been here long enough to know what's going on. There's got to be some leaders and some champions for that fight right here in this room. And I think it's time for some democratic accountability here in the state of Kansas or in the school board.
Sorry, this is a little short for me. First of all, don't mean to attack you, but there are quite a few farmers in Kansas. We're very proud, and I'm not saying that you made a false statement, but boy, there's not very many rich ones, I don't think. And this will delve right into you. I think that you have taken up a very brave subject, fighting globalization. It's a battle that seems very difficult to win, and to tell you the truth, I don't think you will win it. But point be said, there was a specific thing you talked about, NAFTA hurting farmers in the United States. You said that our standards of living today are worse than what my parents experienced, or what my grandparents experienced, or what my great-grandparents experienced. And I just don't see how that is true, because my generation is growing up in a world where I have enormous wealth at my fingertips, enormous information at my fingertips. I mean, information seems to be the real key in globalization, and you failed to bring that up at all, and it really surprises me. I mean, NAFTA itself just doesn't seem to be the cause of what is wrong with the farm economy today. It's the information that we have, that a producer in Brazil can produce soybeans and market them the same as a guy in Kansas can, only he can do it cheaper because his inputs are less, his fertilizer is less, his land doesn't have the same opportunity cost that land in Kansas does. And it just seems to me that that is more of a cause of why commodity prices are low, why my margin gets less and less when I try to produce. And it just really seems like you're ignoring that point completely. I don't think that NAFTA itself has that great of an impact on American producers. What happens in China, what happens in Japan has a greater impact than what happens in Mexico and what happens in Canada. And so if you could address that, I would appreciate it.
Great question. It's a great question. I'm glad there's local agricultural experts in the House to round out the story. And NAFTA was sold as a series of promises. NAFTA, voters here and farmers here backed NAFTA, and I think most of the Congress members in office, at least 3 out of the 4, probably voted for NAFTA because they believed that the exports in corn, soybean, wheat would increase and would grow in the Mexican market and in the Canadian market. And while it has grown at a much slower rate than before NAFTA, and it is far outpaced, has the rate at which imports from Mexico, corn from Mexico, and wheat from Canada has come into the United States has far exceeded the rate at which exports have gone to these countries. So there's been an enormous trade imbalance. I think before NAFTA, there was a $230 million trade surplus with Mexico and Canada, and now that has fallen by $1.4 billion under NAFTA. And you're right, absolutely, that's just one part of it, and I was just trying to explain what's happened in the markets in North America. The World Trade Organization also has a big impact on the way that agricultural industry is organized and created in the tariff structures around the world. China is not yet a member of the WTO, but when it does become a WTO, it'll be probably subject to a lot of that. And as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have assisted in developing export agriculture around the world, farmers have become more and more competitive. I know that Washington State, for example, is likely to lose its apple industry. And when we think of Washington, we think of big, red, juicy apples. Well, China has just planted some like 100 millions of acres. I forgot the exact amount, but it was just mind-boggling how many apple orchards there are. So I'm not an expert on the agriculture sector. It is complicated. Go ahead.
Well, you're making the point that the apples, we're crying because we're losing the apples in Washington, but at the same time we're gaining cheaper apples that are being produced in China. And so we might trade them corn for their apples. Why do we not want to take advantage of cheaper apples in favor of apples that are grown more expensively in the United States on land that can be used for another purpose, wildlife preservation, things like that? What is the advantage towards not wanting to trade?
What are the apple growers going to do?
That's placing a value judgment on this, and we're not. We're
I'm
not
saying,
placing value on this right now. That's what economics does. It doesn't place value.
And says, okay, I'm going to consolidate all the dairy farms in Kansas, which has happened in the last 20 years. There are no more family-owned dairy farms. What's happened to the dairy farmers? I can tell you because I come from a dairy community. They're working as carpenters, and their wives have had to take jobs to support them, and they've lost their farms. So the apple growers, they're going to lose their farms. So what are those people going to do? There's not the jobs. What jobs are we going to create?
Market makes jobs. That's the point of trade.
But that's not.
If I could interject in between this argument that's going on.
Sound like a farmer.
I'm a rancher and a farmer.
Distinction, I'm
As
sure.
my grandchildren are the 7th generation to be in Waubonsie County. And I don't think ranchers are the problem. I think the land grant system itself is a problem in rural America. We got a world-renowned ag economist here at Kansas State that helped write the Freedom to Farm bill. It's breaking more farmers today than in any bill in history. And he knows less about economic justice than a tomcat does about baking gingerbread. We've got a dean of ag that doesn't know the difference between apple pies and cow pies, and he evidently measures intelligence by the length of your tongue and the breadth of your mouth. We've got farm organizations that posture, pose, preen, pretend, pontificate, and prevaricate, and they tell farmers that it's good, that 114% of our net income last year came as a welfare payment from the federal government. I've been in the U.S. ambassador's home compound in Mexico, and I've also been at the presidential palace. And they've got walls around their places that are 12 or 14 feet tall with concertina wire and glass. Most of our ancestors came to the Midwest fleeing an oligarchical type system of feudal serfdom and slavery. And that's where we're headed back today. And I could talk here the rest of the night, but I'm not, and I'm not going to get in an argument. But facts are facts, and the truth is the truth, and what's right is what's right.
Sorry, I'm going to change the subject just a little bit. I don't know too much about the WTO or anything like that, but I do recall seeing on the television just how the protests were portrayed, and I realize that that was partly written in the brochure that you helped organize those protests, and I'm sure you didn't help organize the riots or whatever that they had right there, but obviously it had a very the media gave it a very negative viewing of it, and I realize that the media probably also has a lot of multinational corporation interest in it. But when you do organize protest, how do you organize these protests, and what do you do to prevent the rioting, and just how do you go about trying to prevent a negative media view of this?
Excellent question. I put more than 24/7 of my time and energy into organizing for the WTO, starting about 6 months before November of 1999. And we organized through an educational campaign by going from schoolroom to labor union hall to church organization to talk about what the World Trade Organization is. And we conveyed the seriousness and the importance of this moment in history when the WTO is meeting here in the United States to really wake up the American public as to what this institution was about and how this global economy was being designed and organized and whose interest it was being written and designed for. And we were able to educate in a way that many people did see the historic nature and the opportunity of this. There is a strong history as well of organizing on the West Coast, and we tapped into that sort of militant demand to actually a strategy of shutting down the World Trade Organization through nonviolent direct action. There were a number of different groups that were planning teach-ins and educational events, and I was involved to a great degree in planning the action that dared to actually shut down the World Trade Organization by an affinity group model. We encouraged people to form groups of 8 to 10 people to join with their friends and their communities and prepare for this action by planning to do civil disobedience, which has a long history and tradition, starting with suffragettes and civil rights movement. And we had planned and we organized communities all along the West Coast, and we bring trainers as well as educators on the WTO, nonviolent trainers to the communities. Many of the communities already have nonviolence trainers, but it was the first time in my life that I actually was taught about the issues of structural violence, institutional violence. What's the implications of watching the kind of television that we watch on a daily basis in our society? These kind of questions about what is violence when it takes the form of an economic policy that creates more inequality and leaves children in hunger. And the nonviolent nonviolence trainings, I think, is where we encouraged everyone to get these kind of trainings, to learn tactics to de-escalate police violence, because in most protests, as we've seen now, even in the last couple of years, it's the police who are doing the most violence. They're the ones that are loaded up with tear gas and weapons and use rubber bullets against the protesters. And as a consequence, I think people came with a lot of integrity and a lot of commitment to a form of protest that is really about showing that there is a larger form of violence going on in the society, and we're willing to put our bodies on the line to form, in this case, a human chain around the World Trade Organization, to sit hand in hand in front of all the entrances, to block the entrance of the WTO, to put literally our bodies in front of the entrances so that the WTO was shut down. And we succeeded in that goal. In the morning of the WTO opening ceremony, where they had intended to launch a millennium round of trade talks, demonstrators, probably 10,000 people, engaged in this act of civil disobedience and participated, having gone through the trainings, have gone through the preparation, having participated actually in the organizing of it. We had a meeting that probably involved 2,000 people, if you can imagine, in a meeting through a system of a spokes council where everyone was represented, had their affinity group and their clusters represented, and planned out this action by dividing up the surrounding area in pie charts and sort of slices of the pie, and everyone took an intersection or an entrance and planned to maybe erect a barricade through a big puppet that would form a sort of a blockade, or do some type of blockade. And when we were successful in actually shutting down the WTO, that's when the police came in. I was standing on the front lines on the street corner watching police come in with tanks and with tear gas and with rubber bullets. And before anyone threw any rocks at any Starbucks windows, before any glass was broken, the police were firing on nonviolent protesters. And that's what was distorted tremendously by the corporate media. How did what really went on? It was a police riot that was started, and the media honed in, and then it also showed clips of maybe, I kid you not, a dozen people, maybe 24 at the most, who wanted to engage in property destruction, despite the fact that we had set very clear guidelines for this mass action to create the safest space possible so people could participate and not feel like they're escalating any kind of tactics such as property destruction. There was very clear nonviolence guidelines that we also asked people to respect in the protests. So we're talking like 20, 30 people at the most that broke a few windows, that did a little bit of graffiti. But that's what the media honed in on and showed pictures of around the world. So it really distorted what was going on. The police fired first on the protesters, incited the mayhem, and used tear gas to create these clouds that sent people, crying and sometimes screaming away from where the tear gas was being sprayed, and then a few dozen people. But I think the media ate it up because of their obsession with violence, of course. These were the images that they thought sold, and unfortunately, I think they did. People were shocked to see that any kind of protest of this kind would occur in the United States. It's unfortunate, I think, that we would have probably gotten similar attention because of the mere fact that we had succeeded that day in shutting down the World Trade Organization, succeeded in our goal, and they had to stop the opening ceremony. They were never able to even start the opening ceremony, and within a few days, the actual talks to launching a millennium round crumbled because the protests on the outside were sort of buttressed by some of the concerns on the inside as well. So there is a problem with the way that corporate media distorts things, and that's why we're creating our own media. The Independent Media Center, indYmedia.org, is becoming rapidly known as like the source of information if you want to be part of this growing movement. And now almost every country under the sun is creating an independent media center because we have the tools to be our own media. We've got tape recorders and video machines. We don't need the corporate media to get out the truth and to document the truth so that people around the world can log on now to this website and get accurate information. That's something that grew out of the Seattle demonstration that I think is probably one of the most promising developments yet that the movement is offering to society.
I had a question. During your speech, you seemed to defend, or not defend, but make large corporations and other institutions the attack, or the target of your attack. And aren't those institutions just a result of a structural system called global capitalism? And why don't you ever bring it down to that point? And I don't know. I just kind of wondered why you never brought up like global capitalism, but you always just said globalization. Because globalization can be taken in a way of sharing ideas and then a global economy, but global capitalism can be taken as just the economic system.
There's definitely a struggle for semantics in this work. And trying to find words that people will take the most seriously. I found that when you use words like capitalism, people's eyes glaze over, and they don't take your ideas seriously. They don't. When you use the words of the actual agents of what's going on in the multinational corporations, you can tend to start putting your finger on where the problem is in terms of individual practices, individual corporations. And I have tried to talk about the system. It's definitely called global capitalism, and there's different forms of capitalism that might exist that aren't being promoted by multinational corporations, that aren't being taken advantage of by multinational corporations, that's rooted in local community, that might be an alternative to this form of global capitalism. So there's, I think, some distinctions that we're trying to make in what we call the fair trade versus free trade, trying to put actual names on what can be the alternatives that people can promote so that the discussion is taken seriously. But it is a system of global capitalism that we are, in a sense, trying to dismantle and root community businesses in local control. So it is the system that we're challenging. I think I tried to make that as clear as I could.
I first have a comment and then I have a question. I first would like to say that I'm not sure, I don't really have an economics background. I'm more of an amateur economist, and so I don't really, I don't know. You have used terms like laissez-faire and free trade when it doesn't seem that that's really what you mean, because there are organizations such as the WTO and the IMF which are interconnected with the government. And the very idea of laissez-faire is that a government is not connected to the economy at all. And so I think you can see why. So that's my comment. And my question, which is sort of related, is that in capitalism, which is basically what your speech was against, in general, there is what amounts to just basically what it boils down to is that everybody has a choice. That's a lot of what capitalism is about the ability to choose which product is good for you, which product is most environmentally sound, which product is right in a moral sense, if that's what you choose to spend your money on. But that's how you vote with your money. And also involved in that choice is you can choose where to work, you can choose what country to live in, and this is all part of the capitalist system. And so my question, and you addressed that on several points where you mentioned cases where you vote with money, where students wouldn't buy Nike products, where students wouldn't buy products that were made in sweatshops. And that's basically choosing and voting with money, which is a byproduct of having a capitalist society. And so my question is, why don't you recognize the ability of people in underdeveloped countries to choose to either, and I realize that there are hindrances, but there's usually an ability to go beyond those hindrances to find perhaps maybe not better jobs in that country, but a better country to live in. They always have the ability to protest if they can organize it, things like that. I'm really wondering why you don't recognize that choice that they have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, you're right, and these institutions are saying that they're following a free trade ideology, but the practice is that in practice, it's far from it. Their policies are about corporate managed trade. It's a system of managed trade. They're making a number of decisions about who their policies are benefiting. The multinational corporations that want to have access to the decision making. So I just wanted to make that distinction. Educated choice. You talked about choice, consumer choice, and I think that, was it Benjamin Franklin that said that, this is democracy as good as educated citizenry. And I think that applies as well. This theories about consumer society is based on your access to education and information about the products that you're consuming. How many of you know what the conditions are of the clothes that you're wearing? Do you know if the clothes that you're wearing right now were made by children who should have been in school, who did not have a choice perhaps to go to school because it costs too much money to go to school because they've been denied a system of universal education?
It may sound rather callous, but if they choose to go work in a sweatshop, or if they choose...
If they're not working in the sweatshops, they're working on the farm. Right. So they do have the choice. And they choose not to work on the farm because it's easier and they get better labor.
Many children do not have a choice. I work in Egypt, they don't have a choice.
The kind of the freedoms that you enjoy in your decisions about consumer choice don't exist around the world. They just don't.
The choice is to eat or to work in a sweatshop, and that's not much of a choice.
Then my argument becomes the idea that...
Then you're arguing just to argue.
No. Let him speak. So like whoever said it, let him speak.
Well, then I have to say that it's not my personal fault, nor the fault of the United States, and admittedly it is the fault of the corporations, and I don't necessarily support corporations.
You're buying their clothes.
Anyway, I don't necessarily support them, but it's the fault of the governments that are in existence there. And so I don't see...
I've tried to lay out very clearly, though, why governments aren't accountable to their own citizenry, why these institutions, the World Bank, IMF, these systemic institutions are undermining democracy in those countries because they're more accountable to elites, first world bankers, and economists. And we can continue talking after this break, or afterwards, because I think that we're going to end it here. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Juliette. It is getting late, and if you do want to continue this discussion, there is a reception at the home of Eldon Epp, 709 Ridgewood. So feel welcome to attend that. Thank you for coming tonight.